The morning was cold, as if even the sky mourned my mother's death. The wind moved gently through the trees of the cemetery, and the leaves seemed to bow in respect to the silence. Her coffin was surrounded by white lilies and roses whose sweet fragrance felt too tender for such a bitter day. I stood there without knowing if what I felt was pain, relief, or confusion. When the choir finished their hymn, I realized that something inside me had also gone quiet. There were people I hadn't seen in years, distant cousins, old neighbors, faces that looked more curious than grieving. I, the only daughter, felt misplaced among strangers offering their condolences like they were paying a debt to tradition. My mother had always been a reserved woman, too proud to show weakness, too distant to accept love. Even now, in her final rest, she seemed to be hiding something. While the priest read the last prayers, I noticed an envelope half hidden among the flowers on top of the coffin. It was old and yellowed, written in a handwriting I knew by heart. My pulse quickened, though my reason tried to calm me. It could be anything, maybe a message from someone else. Still, deep down, I knew that letter was meant for me. I waited until the ceremony was over. When the crowd began to leave, I stepped closer. I touched the paper with my fingertips. It felt almost alive. My name was written on it, in the same delicate cursive that once signed my report cards and left brief, cold notes on the kitchen table. To my daughter. It was the first time in years I had seen her address me with any tenderness. My head bowed, and the tears I had fought so hard to hold finally fell. I felt anger, love, guilt, and a strange fear all at once. Why a letter? Why now, after everything? And why hide it there, among the flowers, as if it were a secret meant to be discovered only by accident? I slipped the envelope into my purse before anyone noticed. I couldn't bring myself to read it then. That piece of paper felt sacred, something that demanded silence and solitude. When I got home, I placed it on the kitchen table and just stared at it for hours. It seemed to stare back, as though my mother were still there, waiting for me to finally listen to what she had never said in life. I took a deep breath and remembered the last time we spoke, a short, bitter exchange that still echoed in my chest. "You always disappoint me," she had said. And I, wounded and defiant, answered, "Maybe that's because you never loved me." Those were our last words. And now, that letter seemed ready to rewrite them. Night came, and the house sank into heavy silence. I lit a candle, sat at the table, and brushed my fingers over the envelope again. The paper was cold, but seemed to pulse beneath my touch. A shiver ran through me. Something told me that once I opened it, nothing in my life would ever be the same again. And that was how it all began. When I think about my childhood, what I remember most is not laughter, nor affection, but silence. It filled every corner of that house like an invisible fog, creeping under doors and settling between us at the dinner table. My mother and I lived together, yet worlds apart. She spoke in few words, always controlled, always distant. Her voice had the tone of someone measuring every syllable, as if emotions were a luxury she couldn't afford. I learned early that love in our home had conditions, and I never met them. She wasn't cruel, at least not in the way people imagine cruelty. It was more subtle, a coldness that froze the air between us. When I brought home drawings from school, she'd glance at them and say, "You could have done better." When I tried to hug her, she'd stiffen, pretending not to notice. The walls of that house echoed with what we never said, apologies that never came, affection that never crossed the room. And yet, part of me always waited for her to soften, just once. My friends used to say I was lucky to have such a strong mother. They admired her composure, her elegance, the way she carried herself as if life owed her respect. But they didn't see the weight behind her eyes. They didn't hear the quiet sobs I caught late at night when she thought I was asleep. Back then, I didn't understand what could make a woman cry in secret and live so rigidly by day. I only knew that every tear she had created a wall I could never climb. I remember one winter evening vividly. I was sitting by the window, watching snow fall over the empty street. My mother was sewing in silence, her movements precise and mechanical. I asked, "Mom, why don't you ever tell me stories?" She paused, needle in hand, and said softly, "Because stories are for people who can afford dreams." Then she returned to her sewing, as if the conversation had never happened. That single sentence stayed with me for years. Our house was old, filled with echoes of lives that came before us. My grandmother's portrait hung in the hallway, stern eyes, tight lips, a face that mirrored my mother's perfectly. Sometimes I wondered if my mother had simply inherited her sadness, like one inherits the color of their eyes. That picture terrified me. It was like a warning of what I might become if I didn't break the chain of silence that haunted our bloodline. School became my refuge. I stayed late whenever I could, pretending to have projects or choir practice. I just wanted to avoid the stillness waiting at home. Teachers praised my essays, saying I had a gift for words, but deep down I wrote only to feel heard. I poured into those pages everything I couldn't say out loud, every unanswered question, every bit of love I never received. Writing was the only way I could breathe. One day, I asked her why she never smiled in photographs. She looked at me with those glassy gray eyes and said, "Because smiles fade, but dignity doesn't." That was her motto. Dignity before joy, pride before tenderness. She believed love made people weak. And yet, the older I grew, the more I saw that her strength was a disguise, a fragile armor built to protect something broken inside her. Still, I craved her approval. Every report card, every achievement, every attempt to impress her was a desperate plea for recognition. But her eyes remained cold, even when her lips whispered, "Good." I sometimes caught myself wondering if she even wanted a daughter at all, or if I was just a constant reminder of a past she wanted to forget. That thought haunted me through the years, and that letter would one day prove it wasn't entirely wrong. At night, I used to imagine what it would be like if she tucked me in, kissed my forehead, or simply said, "I love you." Instead, her footsteps echoed down the hallway, firm and solitary. She'd stop by my door, hesitate for a moment, and then walk away. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking love was something that only existed for other people. That belief shaped every choice I made as an adult. Now, as I held that letter decades later, the silence of my childhood returned. I could almost hear the ticking clock from that old living room, marking every second we wasted not speaking. And suddenly I realized that letter wasn't just her confession. It was the voice of the silence itself, finally breaking after a lifetime of holding its breath. People often say you can tell a person's soul through their smile. If that's true, then my mother's soul must have been locked behind iron gates. I tried to remember the shape of her smile, but there was nothing, only the faint curve of lips that hinted more at control than joy. In every photo, her eyes looked past the camera, as if she were searching for something she'd lost long ago. She wasn't cruel by choice. She was shaped by a world that punished softness. I learned that too late. She had grown up in a time when women were taught to endure rather than express. My grandmother, a widow by 30, raised her with a rigid spine and an iron will. "Crying solves nothing," she used to say, a phrase that echoed through generations like a curse. My mother carried that lesson like armor, believing that emotions were cracks through which pain could seep in. So, she sealed them shut, even if it meant sealing her heart too. When I was young, I didn't understand the difference between strength and hardness. I thought her coldness was deliberate, a punishment for not being good enough. But now, reading her letter, I realized she was simply afraid of showing love and losing it, afraid that the world would take everything if she ever dared to care too much. That fear was her inheritance, and without knowing, she passed it on to me. There were moments when I caught glimpses of the woman she could have been. Once, I saw her dancing alone in the kitchen, humming a melody under her breath. It lasted only seconds before she noticed me watching. Her expression changed immediately. She turned off the radio, straightened her posture, and said, "Go finish your homework." That was how she lived, one breath away from being happy, one fear away from stopping herself. She worked long hours as a seamstress, stitching other people's clothes with the precision of a surgeon. Our tiny house smelled of fabric and ironing steam. I'd sit quietly, watching her fingers move fast over the sewing machine. Sometimes I'd imagine her stitching together the pieces of her broken life, thread by thread. But no matter how many dresses she made for others, she never mended her own wounds. The seams of her soul remained undone. I remember once asking about my father. Her face turned to stone. "He's not someone you need to think about," she said. I was 9. That single sentence became the law of our house. Never ask, never wonder. I stopped questioning her after that, but the silence grew heavier. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of pain that surfaced only when she thought I wasn't looking. Now I understand that flicker was guilt. Neighbors admired her discipline. "Your mother's a saint," they'd say, raising a daughter all by herself. I used to believe them. I thought her strictness came from love, that the way she corrected me was her version of caring. But saints don't weep into their hands at midnight, and saints don't lock away letters written decades before their deaths. My mother's sainthood was just a mask to hide a story she was terrified to tell. Every birthday, she baked the same dry cake, always with one candle. "You don't need many wishes," she'd say. "One is enough." But I never dared to ask what she wished for. I think now, if I had asked, she might have said, "To be forgiven." Her life was a long line of unsaid apologies. And when I found that letter years later, every word dripped with the remorse she'd swallowed for a lifetime. It took me years to see that her coldness wasn't rejection, it was a shield. Love had betrayed her once, and she never recovered from it. She built her identity around survival, not happiness. She taught me to fear attachment, to equate tenderness with weakness. And yet, deep beneath that armor, there was a woman who longed to be touched, understood, and seen. The tragedy is that I only realized it when she was gone. Now, as I hold her letter, I can almost feel her presence again, the quiet sadness, the restrained dignity. I see her sitting by the window, sewing under the pale light of dawn, eyes heavy with memories she never shared. And I can't help but wonder, if she had smiled, even once, maybe everything would have been different. Maybe love would have survived in our home. But all that's left now is this paper, this ink, and the ghost of the mother who never smiled. Our house was old enough to remember things we'd both forgotten. It creaked at night, sighed when the wind passed through, and sometimes whispered in ways that made me shiver. The walls seemed alive. They held laughter from generations long gone and secrets too heavy to escape. I used to think it was just the pipes or the wood contracting, but deep down, I knew those sounds carried the echoes of the past. There were moments when I felt like the house was trying to tell me something my mother refused to say. Each room had its own silence. The kitchen smelled of coffee and distance, the living room of dust and old photographs. But the hallway was the strangest place of all. Every time I walked down it, I felt watched. The portraits of ancestors followed me with painted eyes that seemed to judge, to warn, or maybe to beg for understanding. At night, I'd hear faint murmurs from behind the closed door of my mother's bedroom, not prayers, not sobs, but half-spoken words meant for no one. Once I woke up thirsty and went to get water. As I passed her door, I heard her whispering. The light beneath the crack of the door flickered. My heart raced. I thought maybe she was talking to someone, but when I peeked through the keyhole, she was alone, sitting on the floor with an open box in front of her, crying quietly. It was the first time I'd seen her cry. I remember stepping back, afraid of what that box contained. I never asked about it, but I never forgot it either. That box became the heart of my curiosity. Years later, I'd learned that the letter I found at her funeral came from inside it. But as a child, all I knew was that something sacred lived in that room, something forbidden. Whenever I asked what she kept locked away, she'd answer sharply, "Things that don't concern you." Her voice trembled when she said it, betraying the fear behind her authority. That fear shaped my childhood more than her discipline ever did. There was one room we never entered, the attic. Its door was always locked, and the key hung from her necklace. Dust gathered on the staircase leading up to it, but sometimes I'd hear footsteps up there when I was alone. Once, I even heard a tune, faint like a music box playing in the dark. I told her about it, and she slapped the table so hard the cups rattled. "Never go up there," she said. Her face went pale. That's when I knew whatever lived in that attic was part of her secret. The smell of lavender filled our home, but it couldn't hide the musty scent of age and sorrow. The curtains were always drawn halfway, letting in just enough light to keep the rooms from feeling dead. I remember thinking the house looked like her heart, closed but not entirely dark, still holding a little light that refused to die. I grew up surrounded by objects that had stories I wasn't allowed to hear. Every piece of furniture felt like a witness in a trial I hadn't been invited to attend. As I grew older, the whispers became louder. I began to hear my name when no one was there, faint and drawn out, as if from another time. The sound didn't scare me. It felt familiar. Sometimes I wondered if it was the voice of the house, or of someone who had once lived there, someone trying to warn me about the truth buried under all that silence. My mother said it was just imagination, but her eyes always darted away when I mentioned it. On stormy nights, the wind howled through the chimney like a woman's voice wailing. I'd lie awake, clutching the blanket, listening to the rain hit the roof like fingers tapping a secret code. And through that haunting sound, I could almost hear my mother pacing the floor in her room, restless, as if chased by memories. Those nights blurred the line between the living and the dead. The house was more than a home. It was a confession written in wood and shadow. Sometimes I dreamed about the attic. In those dreams, the door was open, and sunlight poured through a broken window, illuminating a small chest with letters inside. I'd walk toward it, heart pounding, but before I could touch it, my mother would appear behind me and whisper, "You're not ready." I'd wake up sweating, her words echoing like a prophecy. Maybe she was right. I wasn't ready then. But one day I would be. Looking back now, I understand that the whispers of that old house were my childhood's only truth. The house knew what my mother couldn't say. It carried her guilt, her fear, and the secret that bound us both. Every creak, every sigh, every flicker of candlelight was a warning I ignored. And when I finally opened that letter years later, I realized the house had been trying to prepare me all along. Growing up, I learned that silence could be louder than any scream. My mother never mentioned my father, not once. It was as if he had been erased from history, like a name carved into stone and later sanded smooth. Every time I tried to ask, the air would thicken, her jaw would tighten, and her eyes would harden into that familiar glassy stare. "He's not someone you need to think about," she'd say, dismissively. But the more she tried to erase him, the more real he became in my imagination. In the small town where we lived, gossip traveled faster than light. People whispered things when they thought I couldn't hear. "Poor child," they'd murmur. "She doesn't even know who her father is." Some said he died before I was born. Others hinted at scandal, a married man, a forbidden romance, a secret affair. None of it made sense, but all of it made me curious. I began collecting fragments of truth from overheard conversations, like a detective assembling a puzzle without edges. One afternoon, while cleaning the attic steps, I found a small metal box wedged behind an old dresser. Inside was a photograph, a young woman who looked exactly like my mother, smiling beside a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, with kind eyes and a faint scar above his eyebrow. The photo was faded, but I could feel the warmth between them. My heart raced. I ran downstairs to show her, but when she saw the picture, she snatched it from my hands and tore it in half. "Where did you find this?" she demanded, trembling. I pointed upstairs, speechless. Her hands shook as she threw the pieces into the stove and watched them burn. "You will never go through my things again," she said in a voice I'd never heard before, a mix of fury and fear. I wanted to ask who he was, but she turned away, shoulders stiff, and muttered, "He's gone. That's all that matters." Her words sounded like a lie told to herself more than to me. I didn't know it then, but that man's ghost would haunt both of us until her last breath. After that day, she became even quieter. It was as if burning that photograph burned something inside her too. She stopped singing while she worked, stopped humming at all. Sometimes I'd catch her staring out the window, her expression unreadable, lost in a world that no longer existed. She'd whisper something under her breath, a name, maybe, but when I asked, she'd only shake her head. I learned to stop asking questions. But curiosity, once awakened, never dies. It just hides, waiting. Years passed, and the absence of a father became a shadow that followed me everywhere. At school events, other children pointed to their fathers in the crowd, while my seat was always empty. I told myself I didn't care, but deep down, I felt incomplete, like a story missing its final page. My mother's silence turned that absence into an obsession. Who was he? Where was he? And why did his memory make her so afraid? Sometimes at night, I'd imagine what he was like. I gave him a voice, a laugh, a scent, all invented from the longing of a child who needed to believe someone out there loved her. I told myself he'd come back someday, knock on the door, and finally make sense of everything. But he never came. Only later, reading my mother's letter, did I learn that he had tried, and she had turned him away. Once, when I was 15, a stranger stopped me in town. He stared for a moment too long and said, "You look just like someone I used to know." My mother was beside me, and I felt her hand grip my arm like iron. She smiled politely and pulled me away before the man could say more. That night, she locked the doors and shut every window, though it was the middle of summer. I realized then that the past she was hiding wasn't dead. It was alive, walking among us. Her fear became mine. I started dreaming of a man with kind eyes standing at the edge of our yard, calling my name. Sometimes he'd hold flowers. Sometimes he'd simply watch from the shadows. I'd wake up trembling, unsure if it was just a dream or something else, a memory I wasn't supposed to have. My mother said nothing, but I could feel the walls closing in around her. The more I grew, the more the truth pressed against those walls, desperate to break free. Looking back now, I see how love and fear tangled in her heart like vines around a dying tree. She wanted to protect me, but from what, or from whom, I still didn't know. All I knew was that my father was real, and his absence was louder than his presence could ever have been. The letter would one day reveal everything, his name, his story, and the reason my mother chose silence over love. The last time I saw my mother alive, the air in her house felt heavier than usual. It was late autumn, and the wind outside brushed the windows like cautious fingers. I had come to visit after months of silence, months filled with resentment, guilt, and unanswered questions. She opened the door slowly, her face thinner than I remembered, her eyes softer but tired. We stood there for a long moment, two strangers bound by blood and regret, unsure which of us should speak first. She looked at me the way she always did, assessing, cautious, like she was reading a book she had already decided not to finish. "You look different," she finally said. I wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a warning. "So do you," I replied, and she smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. The silence stretched between us like an old rope, frayed but still strong enough to hold all the things we couldn't say. The house hadn't changed. The same curtains, the same smell of lavender and dust, the same ticking clock marking the rhythm of our shared avoidance. I sat at the kitchen table while she prepared tea in her slow, deliberate way. Every movement seemed practiced, ritualistic. When she placed the cup in front of me, our fingers brushed. For a second, I felt something, a connection, fragile and fleeting. But she withdrew her hand too quickly, as if even that touch burned. We talked about trivial things, the weather, the neighbor's new car, the price of bread. It felt absurd, two people pretending normalcy while drowning in unspoken history. I wanted to scream, to ask her why she'd lied, why she'd kept his name a secret. why she had built her life around silence and dragged me into it. But when I opened my mouth, nothing came out. My throat tightened. She must have sensed it because her eyes flicked up briefly, then back down to her tea. After a long pause, she said, "You think I don't care about you, don't you?" I looked at her, caught off guard. Her tone wasn't angry this time. It was fragile, almost pleading. I didn't answer. Maybe I was afraid of what would come out if I did. She sighed, staring into her cup as if it held the answers she'd avoided all her life. "One day," she murmured, "you'll understand." It was the kind of sentence that feels like both a confession and a curse. When I left that evening, the sun had already set, and the sky burned with fading shades of crimson and gold. She stood at the doorway, her hands trembling slightly as she held onto the frame. I turned back one last time, wanting to say something, anything, but the words got stuck somewhere between my chest and my pride. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to call me back, but no sound came. That was the moment I realized. We were both prisoners of the same silence. For weeks after that, I replayed that goodbye in my head, over and over. The way her eyes glistened when she thought I wasn't looking. The way her hand hovered in the air, unsure whether to reach for me or let me go. It wasn't until I heard the news of her passing that I understood what that hesitation meant. She had already known. She was saying goodbye, without words. When the call came, I was sitting in my apartment, surrounded by unfinished work and empty coffee cups. "Your mother's gone," the voice said. I didn't cry right away. Instead, I felt this strange hollowness, like someone had opened a door inside me and left it swinging in the wind. Guilt hit first, then anger, then the heavy realization that I would never get answers. The truth had died with her, or so I thought. At the funeral, when I looked at her still face, I saw peace for the first time. The wrinkles of worry had smoothed away, and her hands, always busy, always tense, now rested gently over her chest. I wanted to tell her I forgave her, but the words froze on my lips. Forgiveness felt too small for what we had endured, too late for what was already gone. So I just stood there, whispering nothing, tears falling silently into the flowers. That was the end of our story, or at least, that's what I believed then. I didn't know that hidden among those same flowers, under the weight of farewell and grief, waited the letter that would bring her voice back from the grave. The letter that would answer every question I never had the courage to ask. The church was filled with flowers, but the air smelled more like endings than beginnings. White lilies lined the aisle, and sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting colors over faces that didn't know how to grieve. I stood near the front, staring at the coffin that now held the woman who had once been my whole world and my greatest mystery. People whispered, coughed, crossed themselves. I just stood still, my heart heavy with things unsaid. The organ played softly, a melody that felt both beautiful and cruel. Family members I barely recognized came to hug me. Their words were rehearsed, their sympathy polite. "She was a strong woman," they kept saying, as if strength were a substitute for love. I nodded, pretending to agree, but every mention of her strength felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Strength had been her armor, and also her prison. And now, as I looked at her still face, I wondered if she finally felt free. The priest spoke about forgiveness and eternal rest. I tried to listen, but his words floated above me like smoke, fading before they could land. My eyes wandered to the coffin again. The wood gleamed in the light, and for a moment, I imagined her inside, not cold and lifeless, but awake, watching us, hearing everything we never said. It was a terrifying and comforting thought all at once. I could almost feel her presence, lingering like perfume. When it was my turn to say goodbye, my legs felt weak. I approached the coffin, my breath shallow. I wanted to speak, to tell her how angry I had been, how lost I felt without her, how much I loved her despite everything. But the words got trapped somewhere between my heart and my throat. Instead, I just reached out and touched the polished surface. It was cold, smooth, lifeless. Still, a warmth spread through me, like she was listening. That's when I saw it, a small corner of yellowed paper peeking from beneath the flowers. My pulse quickened. I leaned closer, pretending to adjust the bouquet, and caught a glimpse of handwriting. My name, written in her unmistakable script. To my daughter. For a moment, everything around me disappeared. The murmurs, the prayers, the music. It was just me, her, and that letter. The one thing she had never given me in life. An explanation. I glanced around to make sure no one was watching. Everyone's attention was on the priest, his voice echoing through the church. Slowly, carefully, I slipped the envelope out from under the lilies and hid it inside my coat pocket. My hands were trembling. It felt like stealing from the dead, but something inside me said it was meant to be found. My heart pounded so hard I thought someone would hear it, but no one noticed. As the ceremony ended, I followed the coffin outside. The autumn wind carried the scent of earth and smoke. When they lowered her into the ground, I felt an ache so deep it nearly folded me in half. I wanted to jump in after her, to shout that I wasn't ready for this kind of silence. But then I remembered the letter in my pocket, and that gave me just enough strength to stay upright. People threw flowers into the grave, one by one. I stood back, clutching my coat, my fingers pressed against the envelope as if to make sure it was still there. Part of me was terrified to read it, afraid of what truths it might reveal. Another part of me burned with the need to finally know. Secrets have a way of poisoning what they protect, and I could feel that poison still inside me. When it was all over, I waited until everyone had left. The cemetery grew quiet, just the sound of leaves rustling and distant footsteps fading. I knelt beside her grave, tears finally breaking free. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I whispered, "but I'll try." The wind rose softly, brushing my cheek, like a hand, gentle and familiar. For the first time, I felt she was answering. As I walked away, the letter felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried. It wasn't just paper, it was a key to everything she'd hidden, everything I'd wanted to understand. The truth had been buried with her, but somehow she had left me a map back to it. And that night, when I finally sat down to open it, I realized this funeral wasn't an ending. It was only the beginning. I sat alone in the kitchen that night, the same kitchen where my mother had once scolded me for spilling milk, for asking too many questions, for existing too loudly. The candle on the table flickered, throwing soft shadows on the walls, and the letter lay before me like a sleeping thing. My hands trembled as I reached for it. The paper was rough, aged, and carried her scent, lavender and smoke. I hesitated, afraid that opening it would make her death feel too real. But curiosity and longing outweighed fear. I broke the seal and unfolded the pages slowly. Her handwriting hadn't changed, sharp, elegant, each letter pressed with precision, as if emotion itself had weight. The first line made my heart stop. "My daughter, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. But there are truths I could never tell you while I was alive." My eyes blurred with tears before I could read the next sentence. Her voice echoed in my mind, calm and steady, like she was sitting across from me again. "I have made many mistakes," the letter continued. "Not because I didn't love you, but because I loved you too much, in the only way I knew how." I paused, letting the words sink in. Love. It was the first time I had ever seen her write that word to me. It felt foreign, like hearing a stranger speak my name. She went on to explain how fear had guided every decision she made. I was raised to believe that showing love was dangerous, that vulnerability leads to loss. So I built walls to keep us both safe, and in doing so, I lost you anyway. I wiped my eyes, trying to focus. The pages felt alive under my fingertips. Each sentence peeled back a layer of her silence, revealing the woman hidden beneath. She wrote about her youth, about how she had once dreamed of leaving the town, of seeing the sea, of becoming someone free. But then she met him. He was everything I wasn't allowed to want, kind, reckless, full of laughter. He taught me how to live, but also how to break. My breath caught. I knew she meant. She described him without naming him, but I could see him. the man from the photograph she had burned. "I loved him," she wrote, "and that love gave me you. But love that begins in secrecy can only survive in shadows. When you were born, I thought I could keep both you and him, but life demanded a sacrifice. I chose you." The words felt like a blade wrapped in silk. My chest ached. She had chosen me, but at what cost? Tears ran down my cheeks as I read on. I told him to leave, not because I stopped loving him, but because I was afraid. I thought the world would judge you, punish you, and I couldn't bear to see you hurt because of my choices. So I lied. I told him you had died. I gasped, covering my mouth. My pulse thundered in my ears. My mother had killed me in words to save me in life. I couldn't decide whether to hate her or mourn her more deeply. I pushed the letter away, overwhelmed, but then something inside me urged me to continue. The candle flickered violently, casting long shadows across the floor. The next lines were almost impossible to read through my tears. "He tried to find us. He wrote letters I never answered. He came to the house once you were playing in the yard. I watched from the window as he called your name. I wanted to run to him, to tell him everything, but I couldn't. I chose silence again." The kitchen grew colder as I read, as if the truth itself carried a chill. My mother's voice in the letter grew softer, more fragile. "I told myself I was protecting you, but I see now I was only protecting my fear. I lived behind walls, and I built the same walls around you. Forgive me, my child. Not because I deserve it, but because you do. You deserve peace." I could barely breathe. Each word was both a wound and a healing touch. I held the letter to my chest, sobbing quietly. It was like holding her again, but this time, she wasn't cold or distant. She was human, flawed, terrified, and full of love she didn't know how to give. I could almost feel her hand on my hair, whispering through the silence that had defined us both. For the first time, I didn't resent her. I pitied her. I understood her. And that understanding hurt more than any anger ever had. By the time I reached the last line, dawn was breaking outside. The sky was pale, almost silver. The final words were simple. "The truth will find you now. Follow it. It's the only way to forgive me." I folded the letter back carefully, my tears staining the paper. Something in me shifted that night. The weight of her silence had passed into my hands, but it no longer felt like a curse. It felt like a key, and I was finally ready to use it. Morning sunlight spilled through the window, soft and golden, touching everything in the room except me. I hadn't slept. The letter lay open on the table, its edges curling slightly from the candle's heat. I read it again and again, searching for something I couldn't name, a clue, a hidden code, a meaning buried beneath the ink. Each word felt different in daylight. At night, the letter had sounded like an apology. But now, under the sun, it sounded like instructions. There was something strange about the way she wrote. Certain words underlined, others spaced out oddly, as if she wanted me to look beyond the sentences themselves. My mother had always been deliberate. Nothing she did was accidental. As I traced the lines with my fingertip, one phrase stood out. "You deserve peace." The ink there was darker, heavier, pressed deep into the paper. It wasn't just a sentiment. It was a message, a destination. I got up and poured a glass of water, my hands trembling. My reflection in the window looked older, more like her than I wanted to admit. "Peace," I whispered, testing the word out loud. It didn't sound like forgiveness. It sounded like a place, somewhere she wanted me to find. My eyes returned to the letter. At the bottom of the page, faintly, almost invisible under the light, were initials, not hers. A man's name, maybe. The ink had faded, but I could make out a single letter. R. I pressed the paper closer to the light, and the faint outline of another sentence appeared, a second layer of writing, as if she had written something, erased it, and written over it again. My pulse quickened. "What were you hiding, Mother?" I whispered. I fetched a pencil and began shading gently over the page. Slowly, faint words emerged, ghostly and fragile. "He still waits." My stomach dropped. The letter wasn't only a confession. It was a map and a promise. I sat back, shaking, the pencil rolling off the table. He still waits. The phrase echoed in my head, blending with my memories. I thought of a stranger who had stopped me years ago, saying I looked familiar. I thought of the dreams, the man at the edge of the yard, calling my name. Could it have been him? Was he still alive? The idea felt impossible, yet every instinct told me it was true. The letter wasn't meant to end the story. It was meant to continue it. The house around me seemed to breathe with the revelation. The clock ticked louder. The wood creaked, the air thickened. My mother's presence was everywhere, not haunting, guiding. I could almost hear her voice now, the one she'd buried under years of silence. Follow it. It's the only way to forgive me. I looked down at the page again. There was an address written faintly on the back, smudged but readable. R.H. 14, Linden Street. My heart leapt. I knew that street. It was in the next town over. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my coat pocket. My mind raced between disbelief and certainty. What if this was madness? What if grief was twisting my perception, making me see meaning where there was none? But then I remembered her handwriting, the care, the precision, the deliberation. No, this was intentional. She had left me a trail, and I had to follow it. Before leaving, I glanced around the kitchen one last time. The candle from the night before had burned out, leaving behind a pool of wax shaped like a heart. I smiled through my tears. You really couldn't say it, could you? I whispered. Love, apology, regret, all hidden behind symbols and silence. Yet now, finally, she was speaking, and I was ready to listen. I grabbed my keys, wrapped the letter in a handkerchief, and stepped outside. The morning air felt different, lighter, alive, full of unseen things. The world hadn't changed, but I had. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, uncertainty felt like hope. As I walked down the street, the letter pressed against my chest like a heartbeat. Somewhere, somehow, someone still waited. And I was going to find him. Linden Street was quieter than I remembered. Narrow sidewalks, old houses leaning into one another like weary friends. The morning had turned gray, and the air carried the smell of rain and memory. As I walked, clutching the letter inside my coat, I felt like a trespasser in time. Each step brought me closer to the truth my mother had buried, and part of me wanted to turn back. But another part, the part that had spent a lifetime craving answers, pushed me forward. Number 14 stood at the end of the street, a small white house with a rusted gate and a porch covered in ivy. The curtains were drawn, but I saw movement inside, a shadow pacing slowly. My heart pounded. I hesitated at the gate, wondering what I was about to find. What if he wasn't there? What if he was, and didn't remember us at all? I almost laughed at myself. Us. My mother and me. Two ghosts from a story he probably wanted to forget. I knocked once, softly. Then again. The door opened with a long creak, and an elderly man appeared. His hair was silver, his eyes tired but warm, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. He looked exactly like the man from the photograph. Older, frilier, but unmistakable. The scar above his eyebrow caught the light, and my mother's letter burned in my pocket like fire. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice rough but kind. I swallowed hard before answering. "My name is—" I hesitated, suddenly unsure. Saying my full name felt dangerous, like opening a door that couldn't be closed. "I think you knew my mother," I finally said. His eyes narrowed slightly, confusion flickering into recognition. "Your mother," he repeated, almost to himself. "What was her name?" When I spoke it, his face changed completely. His hand trembled on the doorknob, and he whispered, "Dear God." Then he stepped aside. "Come in." The house smelled of old wood and something faintly sweet. Maybe tea, maybe nostalgia. Pictures lined the walls, and in every one, there was a trace of the life he'd built without her. A wife who had passed, children who had grown and moved away. But the pain in his eyes told me that part of him had never left the past. He led me to the living room and gestured for me to sit. Neither of us spoke for a while. The silence between us was both familiar and foreign, the same silence my mother had taught me to carry. Finally, he asked softly, "She's gone, isn't she?" I nodded. He looked down, covering his face with his hands. "I always knew I'd never see her again," he said. "But I hoped she'd at least let me know she was alive." His voice cracked, and the sound broke something inside me. I reached into my coat and handed him the letter. "She wanted you to have this," I lied. He looked surprised, then smiled faintly. "No," he said. "She wanted you to have it. But I suppose she knew you'd find me eventually." He read the first few lines, his hands trembling. When he finished, he stared at the paper for a long time, eyes glistening. "She never told you, did she?" he finally said. "No," I whispered. "Not until now." He nodded slowly. "Your mother, she wasn't cruel. She was terrified. The world back then wouldn't have forgiven her for loving me. I was already married, and she was alone. We thought we could hide it, but nothing stays hidden forever." His words landed like stones in my chest. "She told me you died," I said quietly. He looked at me with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "And she told me you died," he replied. "That's how she kept us apart. It was the only way she could live with herself." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I searched for her for years. I even came to your house once. You were just a little girl playing with a red ball in the yard. She saw me, but she didn't open the door." My eyes filled with tears. I remembered the dream, the man at the edge of the yard. It hadn't been a dream at all. We sat in silence for a long time, both caught between memory and regret. "She loved you," he said finally. "I know it doesn't erase the pain, but it's the truth. She never stopped loving you." I looked around the room again, the photos, the dust, the stillness, and realized this was what love looked like after time had hollowed it out. Not passion, not romance, but quiet endurance. Two lives that never got to intertwine, bound forever by what they couldn't say. When I left, the rain had begun to fall, light and steady. He walked me to the gate and placed a small box in my hands. "She gave this to me long ago," he said. "She told me to keep it until you came." I opened it just enough to see what was inside, a locket with 2 photos, one of her, one of me as a child. "She wanted you to have it." His voice trembled. "She wanted you to know she never forgot." I nodded, tears mixing with rain. "Thank you," I whispered. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had just spoken to both of them at once. The road home felt longer than it had on the way there. Rain traced silver lines down the windshield as I drove, the rhythm of the wipers matching the pulse in my chest. The box with the locket sat on the passenger seat, glowing faintly each time lightning flashed. My mind was full, but not in the way it used to be. For the first time in my life, I wasn't haunted by questions. I was haunted by answers. I finally knew who he was. And knowing didn't break me. It healed something I didn't know was still bleeding. When I got home, I lit a candle, just as I had the night I first opened the letter. The small flame flickered gently, and I held the locket up to it. Inside, my mother's face smiled from one side, younger, softer, almost happy. On the other side, a photograph of me as a child, missing one front tooth, grinning wide. We had never taken that picture together, yet somehow she had placed us side by side, mother and daughter, finally united. I traced the edge of the metal with my thumb and whispered, "So this is what love looked like for you." The realization came slowly. My mother hadn't been trying to erase my father, she had been trying to erase her pain. Every lie, every silence, every moment of distance was an act of self-preservation. She believed that if she buried the past deep enough, it couldn't hurt her or me. But pain doesn't die in silence. It waits, patient and hungry, until someone is brave enough to dig it up. I was that someone, and in that moment, I didn't feel like her victim anymore. I felt like her continuation. I sat at the table with the letter again, spreading it open beside the locket. The ink looked darker now, as if her words had gained strength since I'd read them last. "I chose you," she had written. Those 3 words had once felt like a curse, but now I saw them for what they truly were, the hardest confession of a woman who had given everything she could. She had chosen me over love, over freedom, over her own happiness. It wasn't a perfect choice, but it was love, in the only language she knew. The storm outside intensified, thunder rumbling like the echo of years lost. I closed my eyes and let the sound fill the room. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I saw them both, my mother and him, standing side by side, smiling. Not the broken, fearful versions I'd known or imagined, but young, free, alive. I realized then that I didn't have to forgive her anymore. Forgiveness implies blame. What she needed and what I needed too was understanding. As dawn began to rise, the rain softened into a whisper. I opened the window, letting the fresh air rush in, cool and sweet. The scent of wet earth filled the room, the same scent that had lingered in the cemetery. It no longer smelled like loss. It smelled like beginning. My mother had spent her life trying to protect me from the truth. And in doing so, she'd given me the greatest truth of all, that love, even when broken, never disappears. It just changes form. I looked down at the letter one last time and noticed something I hadn't before, a small water stain near the bottom of the page. I ran my finger over it, realizing it wasn't for my tears. It was older. Maybe hers. Maybe she had cried while writing it, the same way I was crying while reading it. That thought made me smile through my tears. For the first time, I felt connected to her, not as mother and daughter, but as two women who finally understood each other. I placed the locket on the letter and folded them together carefully, tying them with a ribbon. Then I opened the box the old man had given me. Under the velvet lining, there was another folded note, smaller, hidden. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside, in her familiar handwriting, were just 4 words. He was always yours. My breath caught. I closed my eyes and everything, the silence, the pain, the distance, finally made sense. She hadn't lied to protect herself. She had lied to protect me. The candle burned low, its light soft and golden, like forgiveness itself. I placed the letters in a drawer, next to my mother's old photograph, and whispered, "Thank you." The house was quiet, but not empty. I could feel her there, not as a ghost, but as warmth, memory, and peace. For the first time in my life, the silence between us didn't hurt. It healed. And I realized the truth wasn't meant to break me. It was meant to set both of us free. When I was your age, the letter began, I thought love could save anyone. I thought it could bend the rules of the world if you just held onto it tightly enough. Her words were steady but fragile, like someone walking barefoot on broken glass. I met him when I was 19. He wasn't like the others. He laughed with his whole body, and when he looked at me, I felt seen for the first time in my life. I could almost picture her, young, hopeful, unaware of the weight the world was about to place on her shoulders. He was older, she wrote. Married. I didn't know at first. Or maybe I didn't want to know. The heart has a way of protecting itself with ignorance. I read those words aloud and felt the room tighten around me. The walls seemed to listen, heavy with history. We used to meet by the river, under the willow trees. I told him my dreams, and he told me his regrets. He said I was his piece in a world that never forgave him. Her handwriting grew smaller there, as if shrinking from her own memory. When I learned the truth, I wanted to hate him, the letter continued. But I couldn't. By then, love had already taken root. Wild, unstoppable. And when he told me he couldn't leave his wife, I didn't beg. I just walked away. But a few weeks later, I realized I was carrying a piece of him inside me. You. My hands trembled. It was one thing to suspect. It was another to read it from her own confession. The truth felt both tender and cruel. In those days, she explained, women like me had no choices. I could have disappeared, been sent away, shamed into silence. But I stayed. I told no one, not even my mother. She would have called me a disgrace.
So I lied.
I said your father was a man who died before you were born.
People pitied me.
They thought I was tragic. They didn't know how close to the truth they were. My throat burned. Her whole life had been built on one merciful lie. The candle beside me flickered as I read her next words. He tried to see you when you were born. He brought flowers, white roses. I told him never to come again. I said it was better this way. But I cried every night for weeks, praying you'd never have to pay for my mistakes. The ink smeared slightly on that line. Maybe she had cried onto the page. Maybe her tears had dried into confession. I pressed my hand over her words and whispered, "You were just trying to survive." They called it sin, she wrote. But what is sin, really? Is it loving someone you're told not to love? Or is it denying your own heart to please a world that never cared for you? I stopped reading for a moment, stunned by her honesty. My mother, the woman who had scolded me for even dreaming, had once asked the same questions I spent my life afraid to voice. Her silence had never been coldness. It had been punishment, a punishment she believed she deserved. I carried that guilt like a stone, the letter said. Every time I looked at you, I saw him. And every time you smiled, I saw what we could have been. I tried to love you purely, but love mixed with regret becomes something heavy. I wanted to protect you from my shame, but I see now I only taught you to inherit it. I set the letter down, tears falling freely now. The sins of youth, they weren't about morality. They were about humanity and how it breaks under judgment. Her confession went on, each line more raw than the last. I once thought I could bury the past by pretending it never happened. But the past isn't earth, it's fire. The more you try to hide it, the more it burns. I looked at the candle again, its flame trembling, and realized it mirrored her words. My mother had spent her life smothering the fire of her own heart, and in doing so, she had turned her life into ashes. But those ashes, somehow, had given me light. The final line of the chapter of her letter read like a prayer. Forgive me for being human. Forgive me for being afraid. But above all, forgive me for not teaching you how to love without fear. I folded the paper slowly, pressing my forehead against it. It wasn't anger I felt. It was grief, grief for the woman she could have been, for the love she lost, and for the years we wasted not understanding each other. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat in silence, listening to her voice in every creak of the house, in every breath of the wind outside. Pride is a strange thing. It can hold you together when everything else falls apart, but it can also destroy the very things it tries to protect. My mother carried hers like a crown and a curse. It made her strong enough to survive, but too proud to bend. Reading her words now, I could finally see how her pride had been born, not from arrogance, but from fear. Fear of humiliation, fear of love, fear of needing anyone again. Pride was her last defense against the world that had once broken her. I couldn't let them see me weak, she wrote. Not after what they said, what they did. I held my head high because if I bowed it even once, I would never lift it again. I imagined her walking through town with that quiet dignity, pretending not to hear the whispers, pretending she didn't care. But inside, every word must have cut her. Every rumor must have reminded her of the man she couldn't have and the child she had to protect. Pride kept her alive, but it also kept her lonely. She spoke of her mother, my grandmother, a woman who measured worth by reputation. She told me once that shame could kill faster than hunger, my mother wrote. So I learned to starve my emotions before anyone else could feed on them. That sentence stayed with me. It explained everything, the coldness, the distance, the relentless control. My mother had been taught that survival meant silence. Love was a luxury for the innocent, and she no longer saw herself that way. As I read, I realized how much of her pride had been passed down to me, like an heirloom no one wanted but couldn't throw away. I had inherited her silence, her defensiveness, her need to seem unbreakable. Every time I refused help, every time I hid my pain behind a calm smile, I was living her life all over again. The same armor that had once protected her had grown around me too. And until that moment, I hadn't known how heavy it was. There was a paragraph where she seemed to argue with herself. Maybe I was wrong, she wrote, the ink darker there, pressed harder into the page. Maybe pride isn't strength. Maybe it's fear wearing a mask. I could almost hear her voice trembling as she wrote it, the voice of a woman standing at the edge of her own truth. It was the closest she ever came to saying, "I regret it." But for her, even regret had to be disguised as reflection. Admitting guilt would have meant tearing down the wall she'd lived behind her entire life. I remembered every time she refused to say she was wrong. The small arguments, the quiet punishments, the tears she'd never let me see. I used to think she didn't care. But now I understood that every time she stayed silent, she was trying to protect the version of herself that still had dignity. She'd lost everything else, love, family, forgiveness, but pride was the one thing no one could take from her. It was her armor and her prison. If I could go back, she wrote, I'd choose humility over pride. I see now that pride doesn't protect love, it buries it. That line hit me harder than any confessions so far. My chest ached as I reread it, feeling the full weight of her realization. How many moments between us had died because neither of us wanted to bow first? How many times had I let silence win, thinking it made me strong? Her pride had built the distance, but my pride had kept it standing. We were mirrors of each other, facing opposite directions. As the candlelight danced over her words, I thought of the last time I saw her. The way her lips had parted like she wanted to say something but couldn't. That hesitation had been pride's final act. Even in her last moments, she couldn't surrender the habit of a lifetime. Now, reading her letter, I wished I had been braver, that I had broken the silence myself. Because pride might keep you from falling, but it also keeps you from embracing. And sometimes, that's the greater tragedy. I folded the page gently and held it against my heart. I didn't hate her anymore. I didn't pity her either. I understood her. She had spent a lifetime paying for the sin of being human in a world that demanded perfection. Pride was her tax for survival. But now, through her words, she was finally letting it go. And so was I. For the first time, I felt free enough to whisper the words we both needed to hear. I forgive you. The walls of the house seemed to exhale, as if they had been waiting decades for that sound. Pride had cost us everything, but forgiveness, quiet and small, began to give it all back. Some inherit houses, jewelry, or land. I inherited silence. It followed me like a shadow, quiet but constant, shaping the way I spoke, loved, and even breathed. My mother never meant to pass it down, but trauma doesn't ask permission. It seeps into gestures, tones, and choices, until one day you realize you're repeating a story you swore you'd never tell again. Her pride became my restraint. Her fears became my caution. I was living her unfinished life without even knowing it. I saw her in every reflection of myself, not in the face, but in the pauses between words. I had her habit of swallowing truth when it felt too heavy. I had her calmness in crisis, that deceptive strength that's really just numbness. Whenever someone tried to love me, I kept them at arm's length, afraid that closeness meant loss. It took reading her letter to understand that what I'd called independence was really inheritance, a quiet continuation of her survival. The more I read her words, the more I felt her inside me, not as a ghost, but as an echo. Each sentence she wrote had carved itself into my own life long before I saw the ink. The way I hesitated to trust, the way I turned love into a battlefield, the way I mistook distance for dignity, they were all hers. She didn't raise me to be cold. She raised me to survive in a world that had punished her for being warm. But survival, passed down, becomes a cage. I thought about the generations before her. Women who had lived under the weight of expectations, who had loved in whispers and died with secrets. My grandmother, stern and distant, had handed her daughter the same armor she wore. Be strong, no matter the cost. And my mother, in turn, had handed it to me. Strength was our inheritance. But no one ever taught us that strength without softness becomes loneliness. We were a lineage of women who mistook silence for power. That night, I looked through the family photo album. The faces were all so composed, women with perfect posture, controlled smiles, eyes that seemed to hold back tears. I traced my fingers over my mother's picture, then my grandmother's. For the first time, I didn't see two cold women. I saw two frightened girls who had learned too early that love could be dangerous. Their stoicism wasn't cruelty. It was armor forged by survival. And I realized I didn't have to wear it anymore. I whispered into the empty room. It ends with me. The words felt like a spell, like breaking an ancient chain. My mother had carried her silence as duty. My grandmother carried it as pride. I would carry it as understanding, but I would not pass it on. The inheritance stopped here. I wanted the next generation, if there ever was one, to know love that didn't need apology, warmth that didn't need to hide. Her letter had given me more than answers. It had given me language for everything I'd never known how to say. The invisible weight I had felt all my life finally had a name. Not guilt, not shame, but legacy. And legacies can be rewritten. That realization filled me with something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. My mother's silence had traveled through decades to reach me, but now, for the first time, it met its end in my voice. I took the locket from the box and placed it around my neck. It rested against my heart like an anchor, grounding me to everything that came before and everything I could still become. You didn't fail me, I whispered to her memory. You prepared me. The walls of the house seemed to soften. The air grew warm, and the silence that had once felt suffocating now felt sacred, like a moment of peace shared between two souls finally at rest. The inheritance of silence had become the inheritance of understanding. And as I looked toward the window, where dawn was slowly returning, I felt her presence one last time, not as a warning, but as blessing. For the first time, the house didn't echo. It breathed. The address written on the back of the last page had faded, but I could still read it. 29 Willow Lane, the house where my mother was born. I hadn't been there since I was a child, and even then, my memories were vague. A small white gate, a garden that always smelled like mint and sorrow, a window where lace curtains swayed like sighs. As I drove toward it, the sky grew overcast, the kind of gray that feels like it's waiting for something to happen. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that I needed to go. The neighborhood was quiet, untouched by time. Every step down that narrow lane felt like walking into a memory that wasn't mine. The trees leaned over the street like guardians, and the air carried the faint scent of rain-soaked earth. When I reached the gate, it was half open, as if expecting me. The wood was cracked but familiar. I pushed it gently, and it creaked in recognition, a sound that made my heart ache. The ghosts of her childhood were still here. I could feel them watching. The house was empty, long abandoned. Dust coated every surface like snow, and sunlight broke through cracks in the walls, forming golden stripes across the floor. I moved slowly through the rooms, afraid to disturb the silence. The air smelled of age and memory. On the mantel above the fireplace, I saw something that made me stop, a framed photograph, untouched by dust. My mother, no older than 20, standing beside her own mother. The same proud smile, the same eyes hiding too much. I reached for the photo, brushing off a thin layer of ash. Behind it, tucked into the frame, was another envelope. My breath caught. I pulled it out carefully. The paper was brittle, yellowed with time. On the front, in handwriting less steady but still familiar, were 3 words, "For when she's ready." My hands trembled. It wasn't just a letter from my mother, it was one written to her by my grandmother. I sat down on the floor, knees weak, and opened it. The letter was shorter, but every word felt carved in stone. "You will try to be strong, and it will cost you everything," it began. "You will think silence protects you, but it only builds walls you cannot climb." I was silent too. I never told you I was proud of you. I never told you I loved you. I thought you already knew. But daughters don't know, they only guess. Don't let her guess. Tell her. My chest tightened as tears blurred the ink. My grandmother had known. She had seen the cycle forming, and tried, too late, to stop it. I pressed the paper to my lips, shaking. For years, I'd blamed both of them. One for her coldness, one for her judgment. never realizing they had both been victims of the same inheritance. Women trying to love through fear, trying to survive in silence. I could feel all three generations converging in that room, the air thick with their unsaid words. My grandmother's voice, my mother's regrets, my own forgiveness, they were all here now, echoing softly through the walls. In that moment, I understood why my mother wanted me to come here. This wasn't about finding more secrets. It was about closing the circle. Every woman before me had carried the same burden, passing it down like an invisible chain. But now, in this forgotten house, with their words laid bare before me, I could finally break it. I whispered, "It ends here." The floor creaked beneath me, as if the house itself sighed in relief. I gathered both letters, my mother's and my grandmother's, and placed them side by side on the mantel. Then I lit a small candle, setting it between them. The flame flickered gently, illuminating their handwriting. For the first time, I didn't feel haunted by their silence. I felt surrounded by their love, clumsy, imperfect, but real. Love that had crossed time and pain just to reach me. The kind of love that didn't need words anymore. As I left the house, I turned back one last time. The windows glowed softly from the candlelight, and for a brief second, I thought I saw two figures standing there, my mother and grandmother, side by side, watching me go. I smiled, tears streaming down my face. "You can rest now," I whispered. The wind carried my voice through the open gate, into the stillness of the street. And for the first time in generations, the silence felt like peace. When I returned home, the air felt different, lighter, as if the past had loosened its grip. I placed both letters on the table and poured tea I never drank, watching the steam rise like invisible threads tying me back to them. The house was silent except for the soft ticking of the old clock. I thought the story had ended at the old house, but something inside me whispered that one piece was still missing. It wasn't peace I felt yet. It was anticipation, the stillness before understanding arrives. I began sorting through my mother's belongings again, not out of need, but instinct. The drawer in her bedroom, the one that had always been locked, slid open easily now, as if time itself had turned the key. Inside were ribbons, sewing needles, and a small wooden box I'd never seen before. The lid was cracked, and when I lifted it, I found fragments of a photograph, torn clean down the middle, edges browned with age. My heart stuttered. I knew what I was holding. I laid the pieces gently on the bedspread and began to fit them together. Two faces emerged, my mother's, young and radiant, and beside her, the man with kind eyes and the faint scar above his brow. The tear cut straight through the space between them, a wound frozen in time. I ran my finger along it, remembering the day she'd burned the copy I once found. She hadn't destroyed every version. Some part of her couldn't let go. Some part of her still believed in them. For a long time, I just stared at that image, feeling both sorrow and warmth rise in my chest. The room seemed to hold its breath. The more I looked, the more I saw, not two lovers, but two people trying to exist in a world that wouldn't let them. Their expressions weren't defiant. They were tender, almost resigned. It struck me then, love hadn't betrayed them, pride and circumstance had. And in their separation, they'd both tried to protect me, each in their own flawed way. I took a piece of clear tape from the desk and pressed it carefully along the tear, joining them once more. The tape gleamed under the lamp's light, a scar, visible but whole. As I sealed the last edge, a wave of calm washed over me. Healing, I realized, never hides the wound.
It honors it.
That repaired photograph was no longer a secret. It was a testimony that even after everything, love had survived, quietly waiting to be remembered. I framed the photo and placed it on the mantel beside the candle that had burned for them the night before. The flame flickered again, brighter this time, reflecting off the glass. In its shimmer, the tear line almost disappeared, replaced by a soft glow. I whispered, "You're together now." My voice broke, but it wasn't sadness anymore. It was release. 1,000 unspoken words dissolved in that single breath. That night, I dreamed of the three of us, My mother, my father, and me, sitting by the river she'd once written about. She hummed softly, he smiled, and I was a child again, holding their hands. The dream didn't feel imagined. It felt given. When I woke, the candle had burned out, leaving only a thin trail of smoke curling upward, as if carrying their story to whatever heaven still listens. I understood then that the portrait wasn't just theirs, it was mine too. It was the image of everything I came from, broken, mended, imperfectly beautiful. And though the scar would always show, it no longer hurt to look at it. The truth had finally become light. The silence had turned into song. Sleep came softly that night, but it didn't bring rest. It brought echoes. I found myself standing once again in my mother's house, though it was no longer shadowed or cold. The walls shimmered faintly, bathed in warm light. I could hear faint whispers, not frightening, but familiar, like lullabies half-remembered. The air hummed with the kind of stillness that exists only between worlds. I called out her name, and somewhere in the distance she answered. Her voice was clearer than it had ever been in life, gentle, unguarded. "You did what I couldn't," she said. I turned, and there she was, standing in the doorway, younger than I'd ever seen her. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, and her eyes were soft, no longer clouded by fear. Behind her stood another figure, my grandmother, stern, composed, but smiling faintly for the first time. The three of us stood there, generations finally facing each other in truth. "I didn't know how to love you properly," my mother said, stepping closer. "I thought silence would protect you, but silence only grows heavier when passed down." I wanted to tell her I understood, but the words caught in my throat. My grandmother spoke next, her voice strong and steady. "We all did what we thought was right. We were raised in a world that punished women for feeling too much. But you, child, you were born to end it." Her words wrapped around me like a blessing. The house around us began to change, the furniture glowing, the floorboards shimmering like liquid memory. I could see scenes from the past playing across the walls, my mother laughing by the river, my grandmother sewing in silence, myself as a little girl drawing hearts in the dust on the window. Each memory pulsed with life, merging into one long breath, a lineage of pain turning into grace. The house was no longer a cage. It had become a heart finally learning to beat again. Then my mother reached out, her hand warm against my cheek. "You've set us free," she whispered, "and in freeing us, you've freed yourself." Her touch was so real, it made me tremble. "What do I do now?" I asked. She smiled, that same small, careful smile I'd seen all my life, but this time it reached her eyes. "Live," she said simply. "Live fully. Speak kindly. And when you love, don't hide it. That's all I ever wanted for you." My grandmother nodded, her expression softening. "Every wound becomes wisdom if you listen to it," she said. "We spent our lives trying to be unbreakable. You've shown us that breaking is how light gets in." The room filled with golden light, and I felt something lift inside me. The old sorrow, the weight of generations, the silent grief that had shaped every woman before me. It dissolved, leaving only warmth and understanding. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was holy. I wanted to stay, but my mother's voice grew distant, echoing like a melody fading into morning. "You'll know when to speak to us again," she said. "We're part of you now, not as ghosts, but as strength." I reached out one last time, but the light grew too bright to see. The floor beneath me dissolved into sky, and the world began to spin softly. When I opened my eyes, sunlight was streaming through my window. The candle had burned to nothing. For a long time, I sat up in bed, tears on my face, unsure if what I'd seen was a dream or something deeper. The air in the room felt alive, fragrant, warm. I looked toward the mantel where the photograph stood, and for just a moment, the tape over the tear glowed faintly, like a scar healed by light. I smiled, whispering, "I heard you." The voices were gone, but their peace remained. A week after the dream, I drove back to the cemetery. The sky was clear this time, pale blue, the kind that makes everything feel cleansed. The trees swayed gently, their leaves whispering like old prayers. I carried a small wooden box, my mother's ashes, and the locket around my neck gleamed softly in the sunlight. I'd waited until I knew what to say, and now, for the first time in my life, the words came easily. This wasn't a visit of sorrow. It was one of release. I knelt beside her grave, brushing away the fallen petals from the last funeral flowers. The ground was cool under my fingers. I placed the box down gently and spoke aloud. "I understand now," I said. "You didn't fail me. You just didn't know how to love in a world that punished love." The breeze stirred, warm against my face, as if she were listening. I opened the box, and the ashes shimmered in the wind like silver dust, rising slowly, dancing before scattering toward the trees. "I forgive you," I whispered, and my voice didn't shake. It felt strong, steady, mine. "And I forgive myself, too, for not seeing you sooner." I took a deep breath, feeling the peace settle inside me. I remembered her words from the dream, live fully. It was simple advice, but it carried generations of meaning. I closed my eyes and let the sunlight rest on my skin. It felt like her touch, warm and infinite. I knew then she was finally free, and so was I. That afternoon, I drove to Linden Street again. The small white house stood unchanged, quiet under the shade of the old willow tree. I hesitated at the gate, wondering if he'd remember me. But when I knocked, the door opened almost immediately. He didn't speak, just smiled softly, eyes shining with recognition and something else, peace. Without a word, I held out the repaired photograph. He took it with trembling hands, and his lips formed a whisper. She kept it. We sat together on the porch, watching the light fade into gold. He told me stories I'd never heard, how they'd met by chance, how she'd once dreamed of opening a small shop by the river, how her laughter had sounded like wind chimes. Every word painted a new version of her, one I'd never known. "She never stopped loving you," he said quietly. "And neither did I." I felt no bitterness, no jealousy of the years I'd missed. Only gratitude, that love, even when interrupted, still finds its way home. Before leaving, I placed the locket in his hand.
"Keep it," I said.
"It belongs to both of you." He nodded, tears glinting in the fading light. "You're the best of her," he said. "She'd be proud." I smiled, unsure if I believed it, but hoping one day I would. As I walked back to the car, the willow branches swayed gently above me, and for a moment, I imagined them both there, two souls at peace, reunited at last. Driving home, I realized that redemption isn't about undoing the past. It's about seeing it clearly and choosing love anyway. My mother had spent her life running from her mistakes, but I would live differently. I would speak, I would feel, I would love openly. That was the redemption she had been seeking all along, and through me, she finally found it. When I reached home, the candle on the mantel was still unlit, yet the room glowed faintly, as if carrying its own light. I stood before the repaired photograph and smiled. "We made it," I whispered. The silence around me was soft, forgiving, whole. It no longer felt like absence. It felt like eternity, the kind that hums quietly, reminding you that love never really dies. After the visit to Linden Street, the silence that had once haunted me became something else, a companion, gentle and full of understanding. But the peace I'd found felt incomplete, like a story waiting for its final line. My mother had lived her life hiding behind quiet walls. Now it was my turn to tear them down. I began to write, not for her this time, but for me, for all the women who had ever been told to stay quiet. The words flowed like water that had been waiting decades to move. At first, it was just a journal, small fragments, pieces of memory. But soon it became a book, the letter that changed everything. I wrote about her laughter, her pride, her mistakes, and the generations of silence that shaped us both. I wrote about the house, the torn photograph, the locket, and the dream. Every chapter felt like a conversation with her, a dialogue across time. With each sentence, I felt her closer, not as absence, but as presence. She had given me her story. I was giving it back to the world. When the book was finished, I read the last line aloud to the empty room. Forgiveness is how we speak for those who never learned how. My voice cracked, but I smiled. I sent the manuscript to a publisher the next day, not knowing what would happen. Months later, the book came out quietly, without fanfare. But people began to find it. Women, daughters, mothers, strangers who saw their own stories between the lines. They wrote to me, saying, "I called my mother after reading this." That was when I knew the silence was truly broken. One afternoon, I was invited to speak at a small local library. I stood in front of a modest crowd, people of all ages, listening, waiting. My hands trembled, the same way hers once had when she sewed in the lamplight. "This isn't just my story," I began. "It's ours." I told them about my mother's letter, about how pride and fear can silence generations, and how forgiveness can set them free. When I finished, no one clapped at first. They just sat quietly, not out of indifference but reverence. Then, slowly, one by one, they stood and applauded. After the event, a young woman approached me, tears in her eyes. "I never knew my mother," she said softly. "But after hearing you, I think I understand her a little more." I hugged her, holding her hand the way I wished someone had held my mother's. That moment taught me that healing isn't meant to stay within you. It's meant to ripple outward, touching those who still carry their own letters unopened, their own silences unspoken. That's what it means to give voice to the living. As weeks passed, my book reached places I'd never been, small towns, schools, book clubs, even hospitals. Letters began arriving from readers who said the story helped them forgive or finally say, "I love you," to someone they hadn't spoken to in years. I kept every message in a box next to the mantel. It wasn't fame or success I felt. It was connection, the same kind my mother had longed for all her life. In giving her story away, I had given her what she always wanted, to be understood. One evening, as I sat by the fire reading one of those letters, the wind blew softly through the open window. The flame flickered, and I heard a sound, faint, familiar, almost like laughter. My heart swelled. "I hope you're proud," I whispered. The photograph on the mantel seemed to glow gently, and for the first time, I didn't see the tear at all. I saw only light, the reflection of two souls whose silence had turned into song. And as I watched that light dance across the room, I realized something profound. Love never truly ends. It changes form, it travels through time, and sometimes it speaks through those who were once too afraid to speak at all. The voices of the past had found peace. Now, the voices of the living carried their story forward, not in sorrow, but in gratitude. Years passed like gentle waves, steady, patient, washing over everything that once hurt. Seasons changed, but the peace within me remained. My hair had begun to gray at the edges, and sometimes, when I caught my reflection, I saw her, my mother, not as she had been, but as I had imagined she wanted to be, serene, smiling, whole. The book had traveled far beyond what I ever expected, but I never cared for fame. The true reward was quieter, the feeling that her story had finally reached the light. On a crisp autumn morning, I decided to visit her again. The cemetery was as peaceful as I remembered, rows of white stones, soft golden leaves scattered like blessings. I carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, not lilies this time. She had always preferred simple things, though she never said it aloud. I knelt before her grave and placed the flowers gently on the earth. The stone was smooth beneath my fingers, warm from the sun. "It's been a long time," I whispered. I told her about the people who had read her story, about the lives it had touched. "You're helping strangers heal," I said. "Isn't that something?" I smiled, feeling the wind brush my cheek, soft, familiar, almost playful. "You always said silence was strength," I added. "But look, Mother, words can be strong too." The branches above rustled, and for a moment, I imagined her laughing, a sound I'd never heard in life, but one my heart recognized instantly. Then I took out a small notebook, its pages filled with my own handwriting. It was my second book, one she had inspired without knowing. This one's for you, I said, laying it beside the flowers. It's called The Last Word. Inside were stories from other women, letters, confessions, truths shared after years of silence. Every story was a seed planted from hers. I realized that I had become the voice my family never had, the echo of generations learning how to speak through love instead of fear. As the sun began to set, the light turned golden, spilling across the graves like honey. The world felt perfectly still, as if time itself was bowing to the moment. You know, I said softly, I used to wish I could change the past, make you softer, make us closer. But now I understand. You were exactly who you needed to be, so I could become who I am. Tears filled my eyes, but they weren't heavy. They shimmered like gratitude. Thank you for being my beginning. I looked toward the horizon and thought of my father too, of the quiet life he lived after her, of the peace he had finally found. I imagined them together again, not as tragic lovers, but as souls who had made peace with their own story. Somewhere in the distance, a bird began to sing, a simple tune, but one that felt impossibly familiar. It was the same song I'd heard in my dream years ago. My heart lifted. Some melodies I realized belonged to eternity. Before leaving, I placed my hand over her name one last time. This is the last word, I said softly, smiling. Not goodbye, just thank you. The wind rose gently, swirling the petals of the wildflowers into the air. They danced for a moment before settling back down, forming the shape of a heart over her grave. I stood there, watching, and whispered, I'll keep speaking for both of us. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was alive, full of love, peace, and her. As I walked away, the sunset bathed the path in gold, and for the first time, I didn't look back. Some stories don't end. They simply change form, like light shifting through glass, or love traveling from one generation to the next. And as I left the cemetery, I realized that maybe that's what heaven really is. Not a place, but a feeling that lives forever in the words we finally have the courage to say. Years later, the letter sits framed above my desk. The same paper, the same handwriting that once trembled in my hands on the night everything changed. The ink has faded to a soft brown, and the edges have curled like petals, but the words remain alive. Sometimes I catch the light hitting it just right, and it looks almost new again, as if my mother had written it yesterday. I still read it on quiet mornings, tracing the lines with my finger, hearing her voice whisper between them. It no longer hurts. It simply reminds me. People often ask why I kept it on display instead of locking it away. I tell them the truth, that some things aren't meant to be hidden once they've healed you. The letter isn't a wound anymore. It's a bridge. Every visitor who sees it asks about its story, and every time I tell it, her voice travels a little farther. That's how memory becomes eternal, by being shared, not stored. It took me half a lifetime to understand that silence doesn't preserve love. Speaking it does. My daughter, yes, I have one now, once asked me who wrote that letter. I smiled and said, Your grandmother. She touched the glass gently, her reflection mingling with mine, and whispered, She must have loved you a lot. I nodded. She did, in her own way. Watching her eyes soften, I felt the chain finally break completely. The inheritance had transformed, from silence to story, from fear to love. She would never carry the same weight we did. She was born free of it. When she grew older, she asked to read the book I had written about her grandmother. I hesitated at first, afraid she might see the pain rather than the healing. But when she finished, she hugged me and said, It's beautiful. She sounds strong. And that's when I knew we had rewritten the ending. My mother was no longer the cold figure of my childhood. Through words, she had become what she always was underneath. Brave, complex, deeply human. Her silence had finally spoken the truth. Sometimes, I receive letters from women who found my story years after it was published. They begin the same way. I read your mother's letter and saw my own life in it. Each one feels like an echo of the original, her words still healing people she never met. I keep them in a drawer beneath her framed letter, As if collecting new chapters, she continues to write through others. Love, I've learned, never fades. It multiplies. It finds new hands, new hearts, and keeps going. On the anniversary of her passing, I visited the cemetery again. This time, I brought my daughter with me. The air was cool, the grass bright with morning dew. We placed fresh wildflowers beside her grave, the same kind I had left all those years ago. My daughter smiled and whispered, "She must be proud of you." I looked up at the sky, where clouds drifted like folded letters waiting to be opened, and whispered back, "We're proud of each other." That night, before bed, I opened the framed letter one last time, just to feel the paper again. It was warm to the touch, as if holding the pulse of everyone who had ever read it. I placed it back under the light and smiled. "You lived, Mother," I said softly. "Your words found their way." Outside, the wind stirred the trees, carrying whispers through the night, not of sorrow, but of continuity. And as I closed my eyes, I realized love, once written, never dies. It only changes hands. There are stories that end when the last page turns, and there are stories that begin only when someone finally listens. For years, her silence felt like punishment, cold, distant, unyielding. But now I understand. It wasn't cruelty. It was fear. Fear that love, once spoken, might vanish. Fear that words could never be enough. And yet, in the end, it was her words that saved us all. A single letter crossed decades of distance, turning pain into truth and truth into peace. It taught me that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past. It's about releasing it, so love can breathe again. Because love doesn't end when life does. It lingers in the things we write, the things we forgive, and the voices we finally let speak. I used to believe silence was strength. Now I know strength is having the courage to tell the story. And when that story becomes the bridge between generations, when daughters understand their mothers and mothers become human again, that's when silence learns to speak. So if you still have a letter you haven't opened, a truth you've been too afraid to say, or a forgiveness you keep postponing, this is your sign. Write it. Speak it. Live it. Because the moment you do, love will find its way home.